December 27th, 1979. Jimmy Carter was in the Oval Office, sitting behind the resolute desk in his cardigan sweater, a deliberate choice to show solidarity with Americans dealing with the energy crisis, when Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, rushed in without knocking. It was late afternoon, and Carter had been reviewing briefing papers on the Iranian hostage crisis, which had been consuming his presidency for nearly 2 months. 52 Americans were being held captive in Tehran, and every day that passed without their release was another blow to American prestige and Carter's political standing. But Brzezinski's face told Carter that something else had happened, something urgent enough to interrupt the president without ceremony. "Mr. President," Brzezinski said, his Polish accent more pronounced than usual in his agitation, "we have confirmation. Soviet forces have invaded Afghanistan. Massive airlift operations into Kabul. Paratroopers, special forces, armor. At least 50,000 troops, possibly more. They've seized the capital, killed President Amin, and installed Babrak Karmal as the new leader." Carter sat back in his chair, his face showing a mixture of shock, anger, and something else, a look of personal betrayal. He removed his reading glasses slowly and set them on the desk. "They actually did it," Carter said quietly. "After all the warnings, after all the diplomacy, after all my efforts to build détente with Brezhnev, they actually invaded a sovereign country." He stood up and walked to the windows overlooking the rose garden, his hands clasped behind his back. The garden was bare in the December cold, the trees skeletal against the gray sky. Carter stared out at it for a long moment, and Brzezinski waited, knowing the president was processing the implications. "Zbig," Carter said without turning around, "I've spent 3 years trying to build a better relationship with the Soviet Union. 3 years of negotiations, compromises, trying to move beyond the Cold War mentality. The SALT II Treaty. I put enormous political capital into that treaty. I met with Brezhnev in Vienna just 6 months ago. We shook hands. We signed the agreement. We talked about peace and cooperation." He turned to face Brzezinski, and his expression was one of profound disappointment. And now this. Now they invade Afghanistan, a non-aligned country, a sovereign nation that poses no threat to them. They send in their military, they overthrow the government, they install a puppet regime. This is exactly the kind of Soviet aggression that I thought we had moved beyond. Brzezinski, who had been warning Carter for months about Soviet intentions, who had been arguing for a tougher line against Moscow, chose his words carefully. "Mr. President, with respect, some of us have been concerned that Soviet behavior suggested they were not as committed to détente as we hoped. The build-up of SS-20 missiles in Europe, their activities in Africa and the Middle East, their support for communist movements around the world, these were all warning signs." Carter looked at him sharply. "You're saying I was naive. You're saying I should have seen this coming." "I'm saying," Brzezinski replied carefully, "that we may have had different interpretations of Soviet intentions. You believed that engagement and negotiation could moderate Soviet behavior. Others believed that the Soviets would continue to pursue their interests aggressively regardless of our diplomatic efforts." "And you were right," Carter said bitterly. "You and the Hawks were right, and I was wrong. I believed Brezhnev when he talked about peace. I believed that we could build a new relationship based on mutual respect and common interests. I believed that the Cold War was an artifact of the past that we could move beyond." He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. "And I was wrong. The Soviets haven't moved beyond the Cold War. They're still pursuing expansion, still trying to spread their influence, still willing to use military force to achieve their objectives." Brzezinski pulled up a chair. "Mr. President, we need to discuss our response. This is the first time since World War II that the Soviet Union has used its military to invade and occupy a country outside its recognized sphere of influence. This is not Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. Those were within the Warsaw Pact. This is a non-aligned country, a member of the United Nations, a sovereign nation. I know what it is, Zabig, Carter said, his voice taking on an edge. It's a catastrophic failure of everything I've been trying to achieve. It's the end of détente. It's proof that all my efforts to build a better relationship with the Soviets were wasted. He picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk, thinking, what are our options? What can we do to respond to this? Brzezinski had clearly been preparing for this moment. He pulled out a folder of briefing papers. Several options, Mr. President. First, we can impose economic sanctions, embargo grain sales to the Soviet Union, restrict technology transfers, limit trade. Second, we can boycott the Moscow Olympics scheduled for next summer. Third, we can increase military aid to Pakistan and any Afghan resistance groups. Fourth, we can withdraw the SALT II treaty from Senate consideration. No, Carter interrupted. Not SALT II. That treaty is about nuclear arms control, about preventing nuclear war. We can't let Soviet aggression in Afghanistan derail our efforts to control nuclear weapons. Brzezinski looked at him steadily. Mr. President, the Senate is not going to ratify SALT II after this invasion. The political will simply isn't there. The Soviets have demonstrated that they cannot be trusted, that they will violate international norms whenever it suits them. Senators who were already skeptical of the treaty will now have all the ammunition they need to vote against it. Carter knew Brzezinski was right, but the thought of abandoning SALT II, the treaty he had worked so hard to negotiate, that represented his vision of a more peaceful world, was deeply painful. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Carter said. For now, I want to focus on how we respond to the invasion itself. I want to send a clear message to the Soviets that this kind of aggression is unacceptable, that there will be serious consequences. Then I recommend all the measures I outlined, Brzezinski said. Economic sanctions, Olympic boycott, military aid to the resistance, and a fundamental reassessment of our entire relationship with the Soviet Union. Détente is dead, Mr. President. The Soviets killed it when they invaded Afghanistan. Now we need to respond from a position of strength. Carter stood up again and began pacing, a habit when he was agitated. Do you know what the worst part of this is, Zbig? It's not just that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It's that I feel personally betrayed. I met with Brezhnev. I looked him in the eye. I believed that we had an understanding, that we were both committed to reducing tensions, to building a more peaceful world. He stopped pacing and looked at Brzezinski. And either Brezhnev lied to me, or he's lost control of his own government. Either way, it means that everything I thought I understood about Soviet-American relations was wrong. Mr. President, Brzezinski said gently, you're not the first American president to be disappointed by Soviet behavior. Kennedy felt betrayed by Khrushchev after the Vienna summit and then the Berlin Wall. Johnson thought he could negotiate with Kosygin while the Soviets were supporting North Vietnam. Nixon and Kissinger built détente, and the Soviets still pursued their interests in the Third World. So what are you saying? Carter asked. That I should have known better? That I was foolish to try? I'm saying that the Soviet Union is a different kind of state, with different values and different objectives, Brzezinski said. They see the world as a competition between socialism and capitalism, and they believe that history is on their side. They will pursue their interests wherever they see opportunity, regardless of what they promise in diplomatic negotiations. Carter sat down again, looking exhausted. He was 55 years old, but at this moment he looked much older. The presidency had aged him visibly. The gray in his hair, the lines in his face, the weariness in his eyes. And now, on top of the Iranian hostage crisis, the energy crisis, inflation, and all the other problems facing America, he had to deal with Soviet aggression in Afghanistan. I need to address the nation, Carter said. I need to explain what's happened and what we're going to do about it. The American people need to understand that this is a serious crisis, that Soviet behavior threatens not just Afghanistan, but the entire international order. Agreed, Brzezinski said. And Mr. President, I think you need to be clear that this represents a fundamental change in how we view the Soviet Union. No more talk about détente. No more optimism about building a cooperative relationship. The Soviets have shown their true nature, and we need to respond accordingly. Carter nodded slowly. You're right. Everything has changed. The world I thought we were building. A world where the superpowers could cooperate, where we could move beyond Cold War confrontation. That world doesn't exist. Or if it ever existed, it's gone now. He looked at Brzezinski with an expression of profound sadness. Do you know what I believed, Zbig? I believed that human rights could be the basis for a new kind of international relations. I believed that if we stood up for freedom and dignity and justice, if we made those values central to American foreign policy, we could inspire change even in the Soviet Union. I believed that moral leadership mattered more than military power. And now the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan, Carter continued, his voice heavy with disappointment. They've used military force to crush a government they didn't like and install a puppet regime. They've demonstrated that in their worldview, power matters more than principles, that they will use violence to achieve their objectives regardless of international law or human rights or anything else. So what does that say about my approach? Carter asked. What does it say about my belief in human rights and moral leadership? Was I wrong about everything? Brzezinski was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, Mr. President, you are not wrong to emphasize human rights. That remains an important part of what distinguishes America from the Soviet Union. But perhaps you underestimated how much the Soviets are willing to do to pursue their interests, how little they care about international opinion or moral condemnation. In other words, I was naive, Carter said flatly. You were idealistic, Brzezinski corrected. There's a difference. But yes, perhaps you gave the Soviets too much credit for being willing to change, for being responsive to diplomatic engagement and moral persuasion. Carter stood up and walked to the map of the world that hung on the wall of the Oval Office. He found Afghanistan, a landlocked country in Central Asia, bordered by the Soviet Union to the north, Pakistan to the south, Iran to the west, and China to the east. A strategic location, but not one that most Americans could even locate on a map. Why Afghanistan? Carter asked. Why now? What do the Soviets hope to achieve? Several possible reasons, Brzezinski said, joining him at the map. First, the communist government in Kabul was collapsing. There was widespread resistance, the government was losing control, and the Soviets feared that if Afghanistan fell, it could inspire similar uprisings in Soviet Central Asia. Second, Afghanistan gives them a strategic position closer to the Persian Gulf and the oil fields of the Middle East. Third, they may have calculated that America is weak right now, distracted by the hostage crisis in Iran, suffering from economic problems, still traumatized by Vietnam, and wouldn't respond effectively. And are they right? Carter asked. Are we too weak to respond effectively? That depends on what you mean by effectively, Brzezinski said. We can't and shouldn't send American troops to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. That would risk World War III, but we can make the invasion costly for them. We can support Afghan resistance. We can isolate the Soviets diplomatically. We can impose economic costs. We can make them regret this decision. Carter nodded slowly. The Soviets think they can invade Afghanistan, and the world will just accept it. They think America is too weak, too distracted, too divided to respond. They think détente means they can pursue aggression without consequences. He turned to face Brzezinski, and his expression was harder now, more determined. We're going to prove them wrong. We're going to respond to this invasion with every tool at our disposal short of military force, and we're going to make sure the Soviets understand that their aggression has destroyed any possibility of normal relations with the United States. Good, Brzezinski said. That's the right approach. And Mr. President, I think this crisis, as terrible as it is, gives you an opportunity to demonstrate American strength and resolve, to rally the country behind a clear moral cause, to show that America will stand up for international law and against aggression. Carter looked at him skeptically. "You're saying I should see this as a political opportunity, while Soviet tanks are rolling into Kabul?" "I'm saying that leadership in crisis can define a presidency," Brzezinski said. "How you respond to this invasion will show the American people and the world what kind of leader you are. Will you be the idealistic peacemaker who gets pushed around by the Soviets, or will you be the strong president who stands up to aggression and defends American interests?" Carter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be the president who tells the truth. The truth is that I tried to build a better relationship with the Soviet Union, and I failed. The truth is that the Soviets have demonstrated that they cannot be trusted, that they will use military force whenever it serves their interests. The truth is that détente is dead, and we need a new approach to dealing with Soviet aggression." He walked back to his desk and picked up the phone. "Get me Cy Vance," he said, referring to his Secretary of State. "And Harold Brown, the Secretary of Defense. I want a meeting of the National Security Council in 1 hour. We need to develop a comprehensive response to the Soviet invasion." After Brzezinski left to arrange the meeting, Carter sat alone in the Oval Office, staring at the papers on his desk without really seeing them. He was thinking about the past 3 years, about all his efforts to build a more peaceful world, about his belief that diplomacy and moral leadership could replace military confrontation and Cold War hostility. It had all seemed so promising at the beginning. He had come into office in 1977 with a mandate to restore American moral leadership after the trauma of Vietnam and Watergate. He had emphasized human rights, had negotiated the Panama Canal treaties, had brokered peace between Israel and Egypt at Camp David. He had believed that America could be a force for good in the world, that we could inspire change through our values rather than impose it through our military power. And he had believed that the Soviet Union could be engaged, that Brezhnev and the Soviet leadership could be persuaded to moderate their behavior, that détente could evolve into genuine cooperation. Now, watching Soviet forces invade Afghanistan, Carter understood that he had been wrong. Not wrong about the importance of human rights or moral leadership. Those remained important. But wrong about the Soviet Union, wrong about Brezhnev, wrong about the possibility of moving beyond Cold War confrontation. The Soviets had not changed. They were still pursuing expansion, still willing to use military force, still seeing the world as a competition between socialism and capitalism that they intended to win. And Carter's efforts to build a better relationship had not moderated Soviet behavior. If anything, they may have convinced the Soviets that America was weak, that Carter was naive, that they could pursue aggression without serious consequences. That realization was deeply painful for Carter. He was a man who prided himself on his intelligence, his analytical ability, his understanding of complex situations. And he had fundamentally misunderstood the Soviet Union and Soviet intentions. There was a knock on the door and his secretary entered. "Mr. President, the NSC meeting is ready to begin in the Situation Room." Carter nodded and stood up. He straightened his tie, put on his jacket over his cardigan, and prepared to face his advisors. He would have to be strong now, decisive, presidential. He would have to put aside his disappointment and betrayal and focus on how to respond to Soviet aggression. But as he walked down the hallway toward the Situation Room, Carter found himself thinking about something his mother had told him years ago. "Jimmy, not everyone shares your values. Not everyone can be reasoned with. Sometimes people will take advantage of your goodwill and use it against you." He had thought she was being cynical. Now he understood she had been realistic. The Soviet Union had taken advantage of his goodwill. They had negotiated SALT II while planning to invade Afghanistan. They had talked about peace while preparing for war. They had shaken his hand while preparing to betray everything he believed in. And now Carter had to respond. Not with the idealism and optimism that had characterized his presidency, but with the hard-headed realism that the situation demanded. Over the following days and weeks, Carter implemented a comprehensive response to the Soviet invasion. He imposed a grain embargo, cutting off American agricultural exports that the Soviet Union desperately needed. He organized a boycott of the Moscow Olympics, persuading dozens of countries to join in protest against Soviet aggression. He increased military aid to Pakistan and began covert support for Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen who would fight a decade-long guerrilla war against Soviet occupation. And he withdrew the SALT II treaty from Senate consideration, effectively ending the arms control process that had been central to his vision of a more peaceful world. In his State of the Union address on January 23, 1980, Carter articulated what became known as the Carter Doctrine. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. It was a dramatic hardening of American policy, a declaration that the United States would use military force to defend its interests in the Middle East. It was the kind of Cold War rhetoric that Carter had tried to move beyond, but that now seemed necessary in the face of Soviet aggression. But despite these strong responses, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan contributed to Carter's political problems. Combined with the ongoing hostage crisis in Iran, it created an image of a president who was overwhelmed by events, unable to control the international situation, weak in the face of America's enemies. In November 1980, Carter lost his re-election bid to Ronald Reagan, who had campaigned on a platform of restoring American strength and standing up to Soviet aggression. Years later, after leaving office, Carter reflected on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in his memoirs and interviews. He acknowledged that he had been too optimistic about the possibility of building a cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union, that he had underestimated Soviet willingness to use military force, that he had been naive about Brezhnev's intentions. But he also noted that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had ultimately been a disaster for the Soviet Union itself. The war had dragged on for a decade, costing billions of rubles and thousands of Soviet lives. It had damaged Soviet prestige, had demonstrated the limits of Soviet military power, and had contributed to the economic and political problems that eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In that sense, Carter's response, particularly the covert support for Afghan resistance fighters, had been effective. The Soviets had won the battle for Kabul, but they had lost the war for Afghanistan, and ultimately that loss had contributed to their defeat in the larger Cold War. But on December 27, 1979, standing in the Oval Office and receiving the news that Soviet forces had invaded Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter had not been thinking about long-term historical outcomes. He had been thinking about his own failure, his own naivety, his own misplaced faith in the possibility of moving beyond Cold War confrontation. And what he had said to Brzezinski, to himself, in the privacy of his own thoughts, was this: I believed in peace. I believed in diplomacy. I believed that we could build a better relationship with the Soviet Union based on mutual respect and common interests. I believed that human rights and moral leadership could change the world. And I was wrong. Not wrong about the importance of those values, but wrong about the Soviets' willingness to respect them. Wrong about Brezhnev. Wrong about détente. Wrong about the possibility of moving beyond Cold War confrontation. The Soviets have invaded Afghanistan. They've used military force against a sovereign nation. They've demonstrated that they will pursue their interests through aggression, regardless of international law or diplomatic agreements or anything else. And that means everything I've been trying to achieve for the past 3 years is finished. Détente is dead. SALT II is dead. My vision of a more peaceful world is dead. Now I have to be a different kind of president, harder, more confrontational, more willing to use American power to oppose Soviet aggression. The kind of president I didn't want to be, but that the situation demands. I feel betrayed, not just politically, but personally. I believed Brezhnev. I trusted him. and he either lied to me or lost control of his own government. Either way, I was a fool, and now I have to deal with the consequences of my foolishness. That was what Jimmy Carter said when he watched the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Not publicly, not in any speech or statement, but privately, in his heart, in the moment when he realized that his entire approach to Soviet-American relations had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. He had believed in the possibility of peace, and the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, and everything had changed.